The night Margaret Callahan told 17 members of her family that I was a financial drain on her son, I was sitting 4 seats to her left at the dining room table. The turkey had just been carved. The good wine was open. The candles she'd bought from the specialty shop on Fairview were lit in the silver holders she polished every November. The ones she'd told anyone willing to listen had belonged to her grandmother. The house smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke and everything the Callahan family believed they had earned. She said it the way people say things they've been holding too long. Low enough to sound like honesty. Loud enough to carry. The truth is, Margaret said, looking at her wine glass rather than at me, Daniel has always carried this marriage. Nora's never really brought much to the table. I set my fork down. I folded my napkin across my knee. I looked up at the ceiling above her head, at the crown molding I'd had a craftsman from Dayton restore 2 winters ago because it had been crumbling at the corners, at the light fixture I'd replaced the November before that because the original had started flickering during family dinners and I'd decided quietly that flickering lights in my house were not something I was going to tolerate. Then I looked back at my plate and said nothing. Not yet. 17 people at that table. Daniel's parents at either end. Bridget across from me with her boyfriend of 6 months, a quiet man named Anton who had understood very early that there was a family dynamic he would be wise not to insert himself into. 2 of Daniel's cousins and their spouses. An aunt and uncle who'd driven up from Cincinnati. 3 family friends who'd been attending Callahan holidays since before Daniel and Bridget were in grade school. And me. Nora Callahan, née Walsh. 9 years into this marriage. Sitting on a particular piece of information that had been waiting in a manila folder in my home office like a letter I'd written but not yet decided to send. Margaret had just called me a financial drain on her son. She said it in the house I owned. If any part of what I just said sounds familiar, if you know that particular silence, the one that descends when someone delivers a verdict and the room decides not to argue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and more than I can say, those comments are the part of this that matters most. Now let me take you back. Because that moment at the Thanksgiving table didn't come from nowhere. It came from 9 years of careful construction, and you need to understand the blueprint before you can understand what happened when it finally came apart. My name is Nora Walsh. Or it was, before I became Nora Callahan. I grew up on the east side of Columbus, in a house that leaned slightly to the left and had radiators that banged through winter like they had opinions. My mother cleaned office buildings starting at 4 in the morning. My father drove freight until his knees gave out and the company replaced him with a driver 10 years younger who didn't ask about benefits. We weren't poor in the tragic sense, we had enough. But enough, in the Callahan family's dictionary, occupied the same zip code as nothing. I met Daniel at 24 through a mutual friend at a work event. He was funny in a way that caught you off guard, dry, self-deprecating, no performance to it. He didn't lead with his family's money or the house or the Callahan name. I found out about Ashgrove, the family business, the whole architecture of their standing, on our 3rd date. By then I already liked him too much for any of it to matter the way it probably should have. His mother, Margaret, I met 8 months later. Easter Sunday. The entire family gathered at Ashgrove. That's what the Callahans called the house, like it deserved a name, like naming it made it more permanent. A craftsman-style colonial on Fenmore Road, white columns, a wide front porch, a yard that backed up to a line of ash trees that had been there long before the family had. Inside, hardwood floors, a formal dining room with wainscoting, a kitchen renovated sometime in the mid-90s and once photographed for a local home magazine. Everything in the house had a history, and Margaret knew every chapter of every piece in it. She met me in the entryway with the particular warmth of a woman who has already made up her mind about you and is choosing to be gracious about it anyway. So you're Nora. Not a greeting. A confirmation. I am. I shook her hand. Daniel tells me you work in property management. She was already turning toward the living room as she said it, half-angled away from me, like the conversation was already behind her. Property management, spoken in that tone, meant something like, a placeholder. a gap filler. Something a person does while they figure out what they actually want to be. I had been licensed for 3 years at that point. I managed 16 residential units, 2 of which I owned outright. I had been saving for a third since I was 22 years old, scraping together a down payment in a separate account I did not touch for any reason, not for a trip, not for a car, not for anything. I said none of that. I followed her into the living room and smiled at Frank Callahan, Daniel's father, who shook my hand like he meant it. Frank was the kind of man who measured people by whether they showed up and whether they did what they said they would do. He'd spent 30 years in construction and he could walk into any space and tell you in 60 seconds what it needed and what it was worth. By the third holiday, he'd started stopping me in the kitchen to talk about carrying costs, about job sites, about which neighborhoods in Columbus had real upside and which ones were being propped up by wishful thinking. He understood what I did because it spoke the same language as what he did. And for that, I liked him. But Frank operated in Margaret's orbit the way a moon operates, dutifully, at a respectful distance, aware that the gravity was not his to challenge. He saw things. He'd catch my eye across the table sometimes when Margaret said something sharp and aimed, a small, apologetic look that said I see it. But seeing something and saying something are different countries, and Frank had lived his whole adult life on Margaret's side of the border without ever crossing over. Bridget, Daniel's younger sister, was 31 when I married into the family. Sharp, polished, carrying a master's in arts administration and a full-time position at a non-profit with the Callahan name listed under its donors. Bridget never said a cruel word to me directly, she was far too careful for that. She operated as Margaret's chorus, agreeing, reinforcing, laughing at exactly the right moments. When Margaret called me practical, Bridget called me salt of the earth with the warm energy of someone who genuinely believes they're paying you a compliment. She was not paying me a compliment. The first holiday, I chalked the whole dynamic up to nerves, theirs, maybe even mine. The second holiday, I started keeping a mental record. Christmas, year 1. Margaret was telling Daniel's Aunt Helena, elegant woman from Cleveland, Silk in December, about how the Callahans had always valued education and travel and exposure to the right kinds of things. At one point she laughed lightly and said, "Of course, not everyone has had those opportunities. Some people find their own kind of path." She looked at me when she said it. Briefly. Just long enough. Thanksgiving, year 2. She introduced me to a neighbor couple as Nora. She manages rental properties. Not owns. Manages. I had 4 properties by then, 3 of them free and clear. Year 3, she told Daniel's colleague at the holiday table that it was wonderful how Daniel had really supported Nora in getting her business off the ground, as if the LLC I had built before I ever met her son was something Daniel had gifted me at the altar. Year 5, Easter, in front of 8 people, "Nora, have you ever thought about going back to school? Just to round things out. It's never too late, sweetheart." I managed 14 properties at that point. I owned 6 of them outright, no mortgages, no partners, nothing. I smiled and said I'd think about it. Here's what I didn't say, that the continuing education I'd been pursuing since I was 19 had cost me exactly nothing in tuition and had returned more than I could calculate at any convenient round number. That one of the properties I owned free and clear sat 6 blocks from the house I'd grown up in. That I had put 2 of my mother's old neighbors into stable housing at below market rent because I could, and because she would have wanted that. There were things I'd done with the work that weren't on any scoreboard Margaret kept. She wouldn't have understood them even if I'd found the right words. What none of them knew, what Margaret had never thought to ask, because the story she'd written about me didn't require a more complicated version, was how I had actually built what I'd built. The answer was simple and it held no glamour. I lived below my means with a discipline so consistent it looked like poverty to anyone watching from the outside. I drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. I packed lunch. I wore the same work boots to 3 consecutive Callahan Christmases because they still had years left in them, and Margaret noticed once, and offered with great delicacy to take me shopping. I thanked her and declined. The money I wasn't spending on appearances went into a specific account, and that account went into properties that looked like problems to most buyers and looked like solutions to me. I had an eye for the ones that were problems with solutions. By the time I was 30, I had 6 properties and reliable monthly income. By 34, I had 11. I had a CPA who reviewed the portfolio quarterly. I had an attorney who knew every piece of my financial life and had built my LLC structure with the kind of care you give something that needs to last. None of this was visible at Margaret's table. That was partly by design. And partly because no one had ever thought to look. The story of Ashgrove came to me through Daniel in the fall of our 3rd year of marriage. Frank's construction business had been failing quietly for almost 2 years. One catastrophic contract with a developer who'd gone into receivership, a business partner who had walked away with a significant portion of the operating fund, and a line of credit that called in the loans the moment they missed a payment. By October, the house on Fenmore Road was 3 months from foreclosure. Daniel sat across from me at our kitchen table on a Thursday evening, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked completely lost. I knew what to do. I'd been working in distressed real estate for years. I knew what the property was worth at auction, what it would bring in a private sale, and what it could be acquired for quietly and quickly if someone moved within the next 30 days. I bought it through Clover Street Holdings, my LLC. My attorney structured it as a long-term lease arrangement. The Callahans paid a monthly amount well below market rate, managed entirely through a third-party property company. The LLC name meant nothing to them. They signed the paperwork, believing they had made an arrangement with a private investor who had agreed to favorable terms. They didn't know the investor had attended the last 6 Callahan Thanksgivings, sat through the Christmas ham, and repainted the upstairs bathroom because the original color had always struck her as wrong. Daniel asked me to keep it quiet. Not permanently, just until his parents had time to adjust to the situation with dignity intact. My mother, he said, won't be able to accept help from you gracefully. Not right now. I agreed. I was 31 years old and I told myself I was being gracious. What I understand now is that I was handing the woman a stage and hiding the fact that I owned every board beneath her feet. Patterns don't stay flat. They incline. And by year 8, Margaret had gone unchallenged long enough to stop being cautious about it. The Easter before last Thanksgiving was the turning point, though I didn't understand that fully until later. Daniel had invited a colleague to spend Easter with us, a man named Preston, new to the firm, no family nearby. He was easy company, good-humored, quick at the table. Over the lamb he'd mentioned he was thinking about his first investment property, and I'd started telling him what I knew, the questions worth asking, the neighborhoods with real upside, the carrying cost mistakes that catch first-time buyers off guard. I had been doing this kind of work since I was 22. I knew what I was talking about. Margaret waited until I'd finished a sentence. Then she turned to Preston with a warm, gracious smile and said, "If you want real financial advice, you should talk to Daniel. He handles the important decisions in their household." Preston looked at me. Then at Daniel. Then at his plate. Daniel said, quietly, "Mom, Nora knows more about real estate than I do." Margaret laughed. Light, fond, dismissive. "Of course, Daniel. That's very sweet." Then she turned to Bridget and asked about the nonprofit spring gala, and the moment was gone. Except it wasn't gone. It had traveled. I could see it moving across the table in the small recalibrations people make when they receive new information. Preston would not ask me another question about property for the rest of the evening. Not because he was rude. Because in 30 seconds and with a smile, Margaret had updated his understanding of who I was. That's the mechanics of it. That's why it works. A screaming fight leaves marks. A gentle redirect leaves nothing visible, just a slightly different map in everyone's head. I drove home that night with Daniel making the familiar apologies from the passenger seat. I nodded. I said the right things at the right moments. And when we pulled into our driveway and the engine went quiet, I sat in the dark and thought about my mother. She'd worked 4 a.m. shifts in office buildings for 20 years because the work was reliable and the money was honest. She used to tell me, "There's no job that makes you worth less, Nora. Only people who need you to be worth less." I had been carrying that sentence for 30 years. I'd been letting it sit alongside 9 years of Margaret's verdicts in a stack I kept telling myself wasn't as tall as it was. The morning after Easter, I called my attorney. "The lease on Fenmore Road," I said. "When is the renewal?" "February," she said. "About 4 months. I want to review everything. And I need to understand what I'm legally required to disclose before we renegotiate." A pause on her end. "Nora. Are you sure you want to open this?" I looked at the notepad on my home office desk. 31 entries. 9 years of holidays, and I had written down every version of the word burden I'd ever been handed in that house. Not obsessively. Just as a record, the way a person keeps receipts not because they plan to use them, but because they need to know they're not imagining the weight. "I'm sure," I said. That night I told Daniel. Not everything about what was coming. But the truth about what I intended, that I was done keeping the house a secret for someone else's comfort. He went quiet for a long time. He looked at the window instead of at me, at the yard, at the dark outside. Then he said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" 9 years, I said. "But seriously?" "Since Easter." He didn't fight me. He didn't argue or ask me to wait or tell me his mother would come around. He said, "What do you need from me?" It was the first time in 9 years he'd asked that instead of asking me to be patient. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. In the 4 months between that call and Thanksgiving, I did 3 things. First, I gathered every document related to Ashgrove, the original purchase agreement, the lease terms, the title, the 6-year payment history showing 0 missed months. I put everything in order and placed it in a single manila folder in the top drawer of my filing cabinet. Second, I kept showing up. Columbus Day gathering at Ashgrove, bottle of wine, dish I made myself, smile in place. Bridget's birthday in October, a card, a gift, a warm enough conversation about nothing. I sat at Margaret's table and was exactly the Nora she had always known. Unassuming. Quiet. Practical. Salt of the earth. Third, I ran a number in my head that none of them knew existed. Current market value of Ashgrove on Fenmore Road, $680,000. Monthly lease I charged the Callahans through my management company, $1,400, roughly 1/3 of market rate. Total below market value I had quietly absorbed on their behalf since the day I pulled that house back from foreclosure, approximately $183,000. Over 6 years. While being referred to, at every gathering in that house, as someone who had never brought anything to the table. A burden. Thanksgiving was 4 weeks out. I was going to go. I was going to sit at the head table with my napkin folded and my voice steady and my face arranged into everything they expected from me. And when the moment came, and the moment always came with Margaret, she could not help herself, she had been unchallenged too long, I was going to stop pretending I didn't own the floor she was standing on. The folder was in the drawer. The number was in my head. And Margaret Callahan was going to host one more holiday in my house before everything she thought she knew came apart at the seams. The week before Thanksgiving, Margaret called to discuss the menu. This was ritual. She called every year, the Monday before, with a list already finalized and a conversation designed to feel collaborative. She would tell me what she was making, ask what I planned to bring, and by the end of the call, whatever I'd offered would have been quietly reshaped into something more suitable. The year I said I'd bring a salad, she said, "Oh, something light, lovely, yes, though Frank does love a warm side." The year I said I'd bring a warm side, she said, "That's wonderful, though we always do the sweet potato casserole in-house." By year 4 I had learned to wait until she told me what to bring and then simply bring it, beautifully, exactly as requested, and say nothing about the fact that I had not been asked. This year she called on a Monday at 11 in the morning. I was at my desk reviewing a lease renewal for a unit in Westerville. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. "Nora." Warm. Organized. Thanksgiving. I'd been thinking the usual structure, though I'd love to do the centerpiece differently this year. Helena's lending me those tall tapers she used at her dinner in September. That sounds beautiful. Now. I was thinking you could bring the bread rolls this year. The Parker House style. A pause. Or really, I know a wonderful bakery, I could pick them up for you, if it's easier. There it was. Packaged as helpfulness. What it meant was, the bread I bring might be the wrong kind, might embarrass her in front of Helena, and it is simpler for everyone if I arrive with wine and stay out of the kitchen. I'll make the rolls myself, I said. I've been making them since I was 16. I'll bring them. A beat. Recalibrating. Of course, whatever you prefer, sweetheart. Then, Daniel mentioned you might be bringing some work files? He said something about paperwork. I had not told Daniel I was bringing the folder. Daniel didn't know about the folder. I said, I like to have things with me. In case something comes up. Of course. Another beat. Well. Noon on Thursday. Dress is casual, but Helena will be there, so you know how it is. I knew how it was. I hung up and sat for a moment with my hand still on the phone. She had heard something, or sensed something, or simply run one of her social calculations and arrived at unease without knowing why. That call was reconnaissance dressed as menu planning. It meant she was not entirely unaware that something had shifted in me. It also meant she was not worried enough to change course. Thanksgiving morning. I was up at 6. I made the Parker House rolls from memory, the recipe my mother had written on the back of an envelope when I was in high school, the envelope now soft from handling and stored in a tin in my kitchen. I made 2 dozen. I covered them with a clean dish towel while they cooled. I put the folder in my bag. Daniel came into the kitchen at 8, poured coffee, watched me work. He'd been watching me carefully for a month, the way a person watches whether they can't quite read. You okay? He said. I'm fine. Nora. I turned from the counter and looked at him straight. Daniel. Whatever happens today, I need you to let it happen. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I need you to not stop me. He held his coffee with both hands. He looked older in the morning kitchen light than he had when I'd first known him. 9 years had landed on both of us with more weight than either of us had expected. He was a good man inside a family structure that had never asked him to be brave in the specific way bravery was needed. He set the coffee down. What did you put in the bag? The truth, I said. About the house. He went very still. I've carried it long enough, I said. So have you. He didn't fight it. He picked up his coffee again, looked at the window, and nodded once. Not enthusiastically. Not with relief. Just acceptance. The nod of a man who has known something was coming for 6 years and has finally stopped pretending the horizon was empty. We drove to Fenmore Road at 11:30. Daniel drove. I sat with my bag on my lap and watched the neighborhoods change, the yards getting larger, the streets wider, the houses pulling back from the sidewalk like they had somewhere better to be. We pulled up to Ashgrove at 11:52. 8 minutes early, which Margaret would register but not comment on. 3 cars already in the drive, Helena's silver sedan, the cousin's minivan, Frank's truck parked as always at the far end of the yard under the ash trees. The house looked well. The gutters I'd replaced in September were clean and straight. The porch light, which I had wired myself over a long weekend 3 falls ago when the old one had started flickering, cast an even, warm light across the front steps even in the afternoon. The columns had been repainted that summer. I had arranged that through the management company without explanation, charging it against the property maintenance account. It had needed doing. I had done it. This was my house. I had walked up these steps 26 times in 9 years of holidays. Every single time, I had walked through the front door into a space that belonged to me on paper and belonged to Margaret in every story she told about it, and I had never once said a word. Today would be the last time I did that. Helena met me in the entryway with the specific enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely liked me and had never been able to figure out why I wasn't valued the way she thought I should be. She was 70, silk blouse, diamond studs, the kind of woman who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided and had long since stopped performing anything she didn't feel. Nora. She kissed my cheek. You look composed. I mean that as the highest compliment. Thank you, Helena. Those rolls? She nodded toward the dish towel in my hands. Please tell me those are homemade. Parker House. My mother's recipe. She put her hand on my arm. Save me 3. I left the rolls in the kitchen, said hello to Frank, who shook my hand and pointed at the new gutters with the satisfaction of a man who notices good work. Whoever the management company sent for those, they did it right. I told him I'd pass along the compliment. Margaret was in the dining room adjusting Helena's tall tapers. She looked up when I came in. She was dressed in burgundy, pearl earrings, every inch the matriarch in her element. She had arranged the table with precision, the embroidered cloth she kept for formal occasions, the good china, the silver that had come from her mother's house and which she referenced at least once per holiday so no one forgot its provenance. Nora. She crossed the room and took my hands briefly. You made the rolls. I did. Wonderful. Her eyes moved past me toward the doorway. Where's Daniel? Talking to his father. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the tapers. And I stood in the dining room of my house and looked at the table my money had kept from being sold at auction, set with china that had never been hers to risk losing, and I thought, 4 hours. 4 hours and it's done. The table filled by noon. 17 people, Frank at one end, Margaret at the other, Helena to Margaret's right, the cousins arranged in descending order of favorability, the family friends who had been attending these things so long they had become furniture. Bridget arrived 20 minutes late with Anton, who understood better than anyone at the table the specific art of being invisible when Margaret had the floor. The first hour was clean and social and required very little from me. I answered questions about work with the standard answers: busy, yes, a few new units coming online in the spring, thank you for asking. I poured wine for Helena without being asked. I laughed at Frank's story about the October job site. I passed the bread basket twice without eating a roll myself because I was not hungry, not remotely, but I watched the rolls disappear and I watched Helena protect her 3 until last. Margaret presided with the ease of someone who has never had reason to doubt her dominion over a room. The conversation turned, as it always eventually did at the Callahan table, to the topics Margaret chose. Which was to say, accomplishments, trajectories, the markers of a life being lived at the right altitude. Bridget's nonprofit had secured a major grant. Helena's grandson had been admitted early to Georgetown. One of the cousins had been promoted. Margaret shepherded these stories with the pride of a woman who collected other people's achievements as evidence of her own taste in people. I watched. I kept my face entirely neutral. I ate what was on my plate. Then the turkey was cleared and the wine was refreshed and Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, the small physical shift that meant she was about to say something she had been saving. You know, she said, addressing the table generally but angled toward Helena and the cousins, I was thinking this week about how the house has really held this family together. All these years. She touched the tablecloth lightly. Some things just root you. Murmurs of agreement. Helena nodded. Frank looked at his wine. We almost lost it, of course, Margaret continued. Frank will tell you, there was a difficult period. But the right arrangement came along, and we've been very fortunate. A small, gracious smile. The smile of a woman dispensing gratitude toward the abstract forces that had preserved her life. And Daniel has always been such a support. Both to the family and to, well. She glanced at me briefly. To keeping things stable. It was delicate. It was practiced. It said exactly what it was designed to say: Daniel holds things together. Nora is among the things that require holding. Without naming me as the burden, she had placed me in its category in front of 17 people with a glass of wine and 3 clauses. She had done this before. Every holiday had a version of it. I had let it pass every time because the moment had never been worth the cost. Tonight the math was different. Margaret. My voice was even. Not sharp. Just present in a way that made the table quiet faster than a raised voice would have. She looked at me. Faintly surprised. I rarely started sentences with her name. I'd love to talk about the house. I reached into the bag beside my chair. Since you brought it up. I set the manila folder on the table. Not dramatically. Not as a weapon you slam down. The way you set down a document you are simply ready to discuss. She looked at it. Her expression didn't change. But something behind her eyes did, a rapid internal movement, like someone rearranging furniture they'd been certain was bolted down. The property on Fenmore Road, I said calmly. The house we're sitting in. It was purchased through an LLC called Clover Street Holdings in February of 2018. I opened the folder to the first page. That's the original purchase agreement. The title is in the name of the LLC, which I have owned since 2009. Silence. Not the polite conversational pause of a table between courses. The airless silence of a room that has just received information it doesn't have a framework for yet. Helena set down her wine glass. Frank looked up from his plate and went completely still. Margaret said, "What?" Not a question. A word that had come out without permission. "You've been leasing this property from me for 6 years," I said. The lease is managed through a third-party property company. The monthly amount you pay is approximately a third of market rate for a house of this size and condition on Fenmore Road. The below-market value I have absorbed on your behalf since 2018 is approximately $183,000. I turned to the second page in the folder. The lease agreement. Then the third. The title document. I kept this quiet at Daniel's request, and honestly at my own, because I thought it would be easier. But I've sat at this table for 9 years and been called a burden. A drain. Someone who has never brought anything to the table. I looked at Margaret directly. I thought tonight was a good night to correct the record. Margaret's mouth opened. Closed. She looked at Frank. Frank's expression was not anger. It was something harder to name, a reckoning, the face of a man who has just understood the shape of something enormous he had been standing too close to see. Bridget said, that can't be." She looked at Anton, who was looking at the table. Helena reached out and turned the title document so she could read it. She read it quietly, then set it down. She said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at me across the table and said, "How long have you owned this house?" 6 years. And before that? The prior owners. I purchased it in foreclosure. When it was going to the bank, Helena said. Not a question. When it was 60 days from the bank, yes. Helena turned and looked at Margaret. Not with cruelty. With the specific directness of a woman who has been in this family's orbit for 40 years and has always known more than she said. Margaret had found her composure again. Or a version of it. She set both hands flat on the embroidered cloth and said, "You should have told us." I tried to. 3 years ago I told Daniel I thought it was time. He asked me to wait. Daniel said, "That's true." Margaret looked at her son. "She's been carrying this for 6 years, Daniel said, quietly. While he stopped. He looked at the window. Then back. While this table treated her like a liability. The room had not recovered from the first silence. It was still inside it, all 17 people, each at a different point in processing the same restructuring. The cousins were doing the math. One of the family friends, a woman named Carolyn who had known the Callahans for 20 years, had set her fork very precisely parallel to her plate and was staring at the centerpiece. Frank spoke. His voice was rough but controlled, the voice he used on job sites when something had gone wrong and he needed the room to focus. Nora. He looked at me across the length of the table. You pulled this house out of foreclosure. Yes. And you've been charging us rent for 6 years. Below market. Significantly below. He nodded slowly. I didn't know. I know. He picked up his wine, set it back down without drinking. Thank you, he said. Just that. Clear, direct, no performance in it. Margaret turned to look at her husband. Something moved across her face, not the controlled expression she managed for guests, but something raw, the look of a woman who has spent the evening as the authority in the room and has just understood that the room was never hers to be an authority in. Margaret. My voice was the same temperature it had been all evening. Steady. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just honest. I didn't buy this house to hold it over you. I bought it because it was in trouble and I knew how to fix it and you were Daniel's family. I kept it quiet to protect your dignity. I folded my hands on the table. But the word burden. I need you to understand that word, applied to me, in my house, is done. I won't hear it again. She said nothing. The candles Helena had lent from her own house burned on either side of the centerpiece, tall and even and very bright. I closed the folder. Dinner ended the way dinners end when something irreversible has happened, mechanically, in stages, with people performing the gestures of normalcy because they have to go somewhere and sitting in silence is not a social option. The cousins helped clear plates. Carolyn and the other family friends found reasons to speak to each other in low voices near the kitchen. Bridget organized the leftover containers with the focus of a woman in desperate need of a task. Helena lingered. She was the last person I expected, and the most useful. She waited until the room had thinned enough that her voice wouldn't carry to the kitchen, then she sat beside me at the end of the table and said, "You've known me a long time." Long enough. Then you know I am not someone who says things to be kind. She turned her wine glass slowly. What you did tonight, not buying the house, that's just competence, but the way you handled it. Steady. No performance. No cruelty. She looked at me. Margaret has run this table for 30 years because no one ever made her accountable for it. That changes something. I'm not trying to run the table. I know. That's precisely the point. She stood, put her hand briefly on my shoulder. Call me. Not through Margaret. Directly. I mean that. She went to find her coat. Frank found me on the porch at 8 o'clock. The yard was dark, the ash trees just shapes against the sky. He came out without a jacket and stood beside me at the rail, the porch rail I'd had someone replace 2 winters ago because the original had begun to rot. I built this porch, he said, looking at the yard. I know. That rail was rotting. Yes. You had it replaced. 3 winters ago. He was quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, the quiet of a man rearranging the story he's been telling himself without making it into a scene. I should have seen it, he said finally. What she was doing to you. I saw it but I didn't, he stopped. Started again. A father-in-law should do better than that. You were kind to me, Frank. You always were. Kindness without courage is just manners. He gripped the rail with one hand. I'm sorry, Nora. I looked at the yard, at the dark outline of the ash trees herald, of the trees at the back of the property. At the house I had pulled from foreclosure and maintained for 6 years and never once announced. Come to Christmas, I said. If you want to. Just, come to ours this year. Not here. He looked at me. Something in his face eased just slightly, the way a jaw unclenches when a person finally stops holding something. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. Margaret did not come outside. The porch light, the one I had wired myself, lit the front steps where her guests were leaving, and through the front window I could see her in the living room, sitting in the chair Frank had given her for their anniversary, her hands in her lap, the house quiet around her. The house she had just understood, for the first time in 6 years, was not hers. If you've stayed with me this far, if you know what it is to carry a truth that long and keep showing up anyway, hit subscribe. Your support is the thing that lets me keep bringing these stories. I'll see you in the final part. The silence that followed Thanksgiving was not the punishing kind. It was the kind that comes after a structure collapses, not violent, just final. The sound of something settling into its true shape for the first time. Margaret did not call that Friday. Or Saturday. Or the Sunday after. Bridget called on Monday. I expected the call to be defensive, a soft-edged version of their mother's position delivered with plausible deniability. It wasn't. I didn't know, she said. Just that, first, before anything else. About the house. I want you to know I genuinely did not know. I believe you. A pause. I've been thinking about some things I've said over the years. The way I've echoed her. She stopped. Started again. I think I told myself I was being diplomatic. I was being a coward. There's a difference, and I've been pretending there wasn't. I sat with that for a moment. Bridget had never once spoken to me without the soft armoring of performance. This was the first time I'd heard her voice without it, and it was smaller than I expected, and more real. It's a start, I said. I know it doesn't fix anything. No. But it's a start. Anton sent a text that same afternoon. 3 sentences. I've always thought you were formidable, Nora. I was right. For what it's worth, I'm glad it finally came out. I read it twice, then put the phone down and went back to work. Carolyn, the family friend who had set her fork precisely parallel to her plate and stared at the centerpiece, called my office on the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. She was a woman who dealt in real estate herself, residential, a small independent firm she had run for 15 years. She had watched Thanksgiving play out with the eyes of someone who understood exactly what the numbers meant. I've been telling clients for 3 years that the pocket on the east side of Fenmore is undervalued, she said, without preamble. I've had 2 investors looking for a portfolio manager for a mixed residential and commercial development. I told them I'd refer someone competent after the new year. She paused. Would you be interested in a conversation? I told her I would. That conversation, 6 weeks later, turned into a consulting arrangement that added 4 figures to my monthly income and introduced me to 2 investors who became long-term partners. Not because of Thanksgiving, not because of the folder, not because the room had shifted. Because Carolyn had watched me handle a moment that would have broken most people with composure and professionalism, and she had correctly concluded that I was someone she wanted in her corner. Competence, compounded over time, finds its own audience. It just sometimes needs the room to get quiet enough for people to hear it. Margaret called on a Thursday, 11 days after Thanksgiving. I was on a job site in Bexley when my phone buzzed. I stepped away from the crew and answered. She didn't open with warmth or with an apology. She opened with, I'd like to understand the arrangement. The financial terms. The lease. Not hello. Not I've been thinking. Just the terms. She was approaching this the way she approached everything she couldn't control, by trying to understand the structure well enough to find a foothold in it. The lease renews in February, I said. The current terms are well below market. That will continue as long as Daniel and I are married and as long as I choose to extend it. A pause. And if you choose not to extend it? Then we negotiate. Or we don't. Either way, the property is mine and the terms are mine to set. Another pause. Longer. I owe you an apology, she said finally. The words were tight, assembled with difficulty, like someone who had not used them in years and had to find them in the back of a drawer. For the things I have said at this table. For the word I used. I let the silence stand for a moment. Not to punish her. Because some things should not be rushed through. I hear you, I said. That's all? What else would you like me to say, Margaret? I thought. She stopped. I expected more of a response. I'm not angry, I said. I stopped being angry about this a while ago. I just needed the truth to be on the table. I looked across the job site, at the work in progress, at the frame of something being built from the ground up. An apology is a good start. What comes after it is what matters. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you're not what I expected you to be. I know. I think I knew that for a long time and found it easier to. She didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. I had been finishing her sentences in my head for 9 years. I understood the grammar of what she left unsaid. Come to Christmas, I said. Frank's already coming to ours. You should come. A very long pause. All right, she said. Quietly. Without the syrup. It was the first time I had ever heard her agree to something I had offered without reframing it as her own idea. We hung up without ceremony. I stood on the job site for another minute, phone still in hand, listening to the sound of work being done, nail guns, a circular saw, someone calling a measurement across the frame, and I thought about my mother. About the 4 a.m. shifts and the envelope recipe and the sentence she had given me like a tool I would not understand the use of until I needed it. There's no job that makes you worth less, Nora. Only people who need you to be worth less. She had been right. She had always been right. I had just spent 9 years standing in a room where someone needed me to be worth less, and I had outlasted her need. Christmas at our house, the first one I had ever hosted for the Callahans, was small and imperfect and nothing like Ashgrove. Our dining room table seats 8 when you add the leaf. I borrowed 2 folding chairs from the neighbor across the street. The centerpiece was candles I already owned and a handful of pine branches from the yard. I made the rolls again. I made my mother's German chocolate cake. Daniel made the ham. Margaret arrived with Frank and Bridget and Anton. She was wearing the burgundy again but without the pearls. She stood in our entryway and looked around the house, our house, the one Daniel and I had bought together 7 years ago, the one with the kitchen I had renovated myself over a long weekend the spring we moved in, and I watched her take it in. It was a good house. Not a grand one. But everything in it had been chosen, every repair done right, every corner kept honestly. It looked like what it was, a house where someone with excellent instincts and no interest in appearances had been paying careful attention for 7 years. Margaret looked at the kitchen. At the tile work I had laid myself. At the shelving I had built over the back window. She said, "You did all of this yourself?" "Most of it." She nodded slowly. Not approvingly, exactly. Something more complicated than approval. The nod of a woman recalibrating her understanding of who she had been sitting across from for 9 years. Frank put his hand on the back of the chair I offered him and said, "This is a good room." It was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. I told him I'd worked hard on it. Dinner was not transformed. Margaret did not become a different person between Thanksgiving and Christmas. She still organized the serving dishes without being asked. She still referenced the Callahan silver, which she had brought wrapped in cloth in a tote bag, unprompted. She still asked Bridget more questions than she asked me. But she did not call me a burden. She did not redirect my sentences. When Helena called during dessert to wish everyone well and Margaret handed me the phone, she said, "Nora, Helena wants to speak with you." Just my name. No qualifier. No footnote. It was not a complete reversal. It was a beginning. And I was 40 years old and I had learned that beginnings, honest ones, are worth more than the performances that come wrapped in the appearance of a finished thing. February. The lease renewal on Ashgrove came through my attorney's office on a Tuesday. I reviewed the terms, made one adjustment, a modest increase to reflect 3 years of deferred maintenance I had covered without discussion, and had it sent to the management company. Margaret signed it within the week. She did not call to negotiate. She did not call to explain or argue or perform the process as something more dignified than what it was. She signed it and returned it, and in that signature was the acknowledgement that the structure had always been mine and she was now living inside it honestly, with her eyes open. I filed the paperwork and went back to work. That spring I closed on property number 12, a duplex in Clintonville that needed full electrical and a kitchen gut. My kind of project. I brought Marco, my best field person, on the walkthrough, and he found 3 things in 40 minutes that I had also found and 2 things I'd missed. "You're getting better than me," I told him. He grinned. "Trying to." I thought about what it had cost me to find my way to this work and this version of myself. 16 years of building something that looked like nothing from the outside. 9 years of holidays in a room where I was written as a footnote in a story I actually owned. The patience of keeping a truth in a folder while someone called me what I was not. I don't know that I would have built it differently. The invisibility had been part of the architecture. When nobody watches what you're doing, you can do it entirely on your own terms. Here is where things stand now. Ashgrove is still standing on Fenmore Road. The ash trees Frank planted 30 years ago shade the south side of the yard in the summers, and the porch light I wired still comes on at dusk, every evening, exactly when it's supposed to. The Callahan Thanksgivings still happen. But they happen at our house now, and I set the table, and Daniel carves the turkey, and when someone asks what I do, I tell them. Fully, plainly, with no apology in my voice and no footnotes at the end. Margaret comes. She sits in the chair closest to the kitchen because old habits are the last things to change, and she still sometimes catches herself mid-sentence in a way that tells me she had been about to say something she has decided not to. That caught sentence, held, revised, that is the work. That is what change actually looks like when it is real and not performed. Frank calls me once a month, usually on a Sunday evening, to talk about a job site or a property or something he read about the Columbus market. Last November he told me I had more equity than anyone he'd known at my age. I told him I was still working on it. He said, "Good. Don't stop. Bridget and I are not close, not the way sisters sometimes are. But we are honest with each other now in a way we were not before, and honestly is the better foundation." She introduces me at events as her sister-in-law who runs a real estate portfolio, not as Daniel's wife who manages properties, and I have noticed the difference because the difference is real and she knows it. Daniel and I are still together. Still working on the particular repair that 9 years of one partner absorbing damage requires. It is not simple and I am not going to tell you it is. But he stood at that Thanksgiving table and told the truth when it mattered, and that is a thing I can build on. My mother's recipe tin sits in my kitchen next to the stove. The envelope with the Parker House rolls recipe is still there, soft from handling, her handwriting faded but legible. I make them every Thanksgiving. I make them every Christmas. I will make them for the rest of my life because they are her recipe and she was right about almost everything, and the least I can do is keep the things she handed me. I am not a burden. I never was. I was just waiting in a room that didn't know yet what it was sitting on. And if you are the one your family has underestimated, the quiet one, the practical one, the one without the right degree or the right title or the right performance of success, I will not tell you what to do with that. You already know what you've built. You've been building it in the spaces where no one was watching, and you know exactly what it is worth. The table doesn't decide that. You do. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story stayed with you, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you'll find something there that speaks to you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Every single one of you is the reason I keep telling these stories. I'll see you in the next one.